So, Caroline Skinner, Director of Urban Policy Programs at Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WIEGO. You're most welcome.
I'm Caroline, and just to remind participants, WIEGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, is a network of networks, and I run the urban program within it. And I'm also based at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town.
So, Caroline, we've invited you to share with us just how social change can happen. And we've asked you to present us with examples from WIEGO. I wonder if you could share with us, one, what makes the urban particularly challenging to change? And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how that change can happen.
But just to be mindful that there are 1 billion people who live in slums, and 61% of all people who are employed globally are employed informally. So this suggests that most people who live or work have created their own settlements and their own work. And yet, if we look across our continent and across the global south, there is a tendency to not celebrate these developments, and yet there's a lot of hardship, so they need not be celebrated. But we've got to work with what there is. So cities are largely self-created. And maybe just to give you one example, where the mayors across the continent at the moment are thinking, via a program within the ACC about urban employment and how to create urban employment. And my provocation back to them is, people are employed. You've got to really understand what people are currently doing and how it can be enhanced. So that's really and yet I think a lot of the frameworks that people are working with are based on a different sense of what a modern city should be like, which is not with slums and not with informal employment. And I think the real challenge is to imagine cities differently, to say, actually, slum upgrading, work with people where they're at. So let's try and get, decent water and sanitation into and have slum upgrading, and work with informal workers and enhance their existing activities and make them more secure, rather than kind of doing away with them. So WIEGO is a network of networks, and we've been around for about 25 years. And the focus is on informal employment, as the name suggests. And the kind of underlying thinking about how change happens is that individually, informal workers have very little power, but collectively they can really change things. So the founding organization is the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. We provide both support to organizing, but also really look for mindset change. So what are the alternative frameworks, if it's in economics or if it's in urban planning or in design, that can help people, but also to secure a seat at the table. So within local governance processes, within national processes, but also in global processes, because that's often where mindsets are shaped. So like, for example, in the New Urban Agenda, which is a key kind of framework and reference point for urbanists.
So I'm going to ask you just to unpack that for us a little bit. You've referred to networks organizing, you've referred to the development of alternative frameworks and tools, and those are there's quite a vast distance, I suppose, between those. We sort of think about community-based organizations, trade unions organizing. So how does what happens at the grassroots inform the development of those frameworks? And as you said, a seat at the table, whether it's at a global scale or a national scale.
In many ways, we support what we often refer to as the art of the possible, very people-centered approaches, in this case to waste management, and try and amplify and support those at city level, but also in national policy and then globally. So to say, if it's the New Urban Agenda, or for example, the Plastics Treaty, which is in the process of being negotiated now. to make sure that those are visible, amplified, seen as very valid. And then, it's always about the virtuous circle. So where there are these lovely initiatives to get them into national and global policy thinking, which then reinforces at a local level these initiatives. So, and similarly with street vendor organizations, incorporating street and market vendors into urban plans in ways that are viable, that enhance these workers' livelihoods, and then to kind of suggest to planners that they plan differently, and to make sure that commitments are made in policy that then can secure people's livelihoods, on the ground. But it's critical to be driven by worker-based organizations who often understand the context best, and really have experimented with what works and what doesn't work in their particular context.
I want to take us back to some of the stats that you cited. 1 billion people living in slums, working in slums, forging a life in sort of very informal context. And I wonder if you can tell us how that virtuous circle is set into motion. How do you move from that place where people may not as be familiar with the discourses and with the negotiations or the arguments that are presented and motivating for particular modes of social change? How do you set that virtuous circle into motion? And then how does it get carried through until it is informing policy development or policy reform?
So it's about, supporting the initiatives that are happening, sharing a lot between membership-based organizations globally. So again, to use the waste pickers example, there's a lot of sharing between waste picker organizations about how to deliver services best, how to challenge where there are, where there are cities that are deciding a different path and trying to get the big players and the incineration companies in to challenge that legally. So it's those advocacy strategies as well. And then to translate that into the research space, and sometimes that's retraining economists and urban practitioners in different ways. So actually publishing is quite important, and then to be really watching both national and global policy processes to see where we can best both suggest alternatives and make visible realities. But also get worker representatives a seat at the table so that they are speaking for themselves as to what change they demand at all those levels, local, national, and global.
I wonder if you could then talk us through what is it that WIEGO seeks to achieve in the world in the short, the medium, and the long term? And I guess just to understand how that virtuous circle manifests within the world in a concrete way. So in other words, how will WIEGO know that there has been success in terms of the implementation of this quite particular theory of change?
In an urban arena, what we're calling for are inclusive cities. So cities that where the urban practitioner, the well-meaning local official is walking alongside the slum dweller who's often working in their home, and the street vendor, the waste picker, to come up with models that are and approaches that are livelihood enhancing. It's a very different city form where informal workers and dwellers are very much incorporated into the urban fabric. It's not the kind of modern Dubai lookalike that we're calling for. And people-centered models. So if it's waste pickers who are central to the municipal waste management system, if it's street and market vendors who are central to the food system that are incorporated in a way that provides, water and shelter at their site. We haven't paid enough attention to the very gendered nature of the informal economy, that most, it's a disproportionate source of employment for women. And women's needs being articulated both within their organizations and within the policy processes is really critical. Recognizing that does suggest quite a different urban practice. So not the top-down master planning, not the urban designer who's very keen, an architect who's very focused on objects rather than on systems.
What I've heard you say is that the dignity of people living and working in informal ways really needs to be at the center and at the heart. That cities need to be people-centric. They need to be consulting people on their needs, and they need to be responding to those and ensuring that residents of cities are a part of the thinking about what works and what doesn't work for them. I wonder what that means in terms of the education that is needed.
Lovely question. I think that it does suggest something quite different from, and let's use planning as an example, where, I think the implicit thinking within traditional planning approaches is that our cities are yet to be made. So the master planner stands above the city, and has a big vision, rather than looking at what's happening on the ground. So it's a different set of sensibilities that really gets into the nitty-gritty of what's happening, very context specific, and has to hold a big vision of saying we want inclusive cities, we want cities that work for all participants, not, you've got to always balance things.
How does WIEGO frame the role, for example, of a waste picker, so that they're not seen as a nuisance? Or how do you understand the role of that person to be within the fabric of a city?
If one starts to navigate the city with a work lens, with a let's see what value people are adding, and see how it can be enhanced. So that food vendor, if they have access to water and sanitation and shelter to prevent their goods from being spoiled quickly, will be providing a much better service to your poorer consumer. The waste picker who is stopping a whole lot of content from going to dumps, or being incinerated, which is incredibly problematic for the environment. So providing this service rather than this notion of like the scavenger who's a blight on our, as you had said, on the urban landscape.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and all the best to you and to your colleagues at WIEGO.
Thank you.